but this has always been a tension of people who think they have the answer because their knowledge of the 3 volumes of Capital or whatever it is greater than yours, and if we just master the formula and then apply it, we'll know what to do. But that's not how they work. And they were in the connection of what is happening in that Chrysler factory today and what is happening on Field Street today, and how can we analyze and think about that and not get stuck and not think that we have figured out the doctrine and the template. It goes to the point I think that you made about, there's this promised land and we know what it's supposed to feel like, and so we'll know when we get there, and then we can, take a nap or something. I don't know. You never got that from them. I have to say one other thing that Stephen, you and I have talked about. They weren't either individually or together always easy to be with. And not just because they challenged you, which they did, but because they weren't perfect and they had their own spats and their own arguments and I can remember sort of sitting there saying, well, you all just, when you get through with your own argument, let me know. And maybe I can rejoin the conversation. But I think that's all consistent with what the book says and kind of who they were and what I learned from them. Okay, Shay, come on.
Well, actually, I was thinking Becca's here as a young person who knew Jimmy and Grace. She was the third volunteer of Detroit Summer. Second. Allison knew Jimmy and Grace. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Shay, for answering. Facilitator. But I think what I caught of what you were saying was really helping me think about that too, and that is also the main thing that I valued in spending time with Jimmy and Grace, is that, or it was maybe the first thing I remember about Jimmy and Grace, is that especially Grace right away was asking me questions and expecting me to have answers and really listening to them and not saying or teaching or telling. And so much of what they've done ever since then has been the same process of listening and asking and, the conversations in Maine. And it's so applicable to what you were talking about the most important thing being networks. And Jimmy always said, people without people, are not, I can't even say all of his words, but, like the value of relationships was so important to them. And they were never people to preach, except that they preached that other people needed to figure out their own mind and their own answers. And like you said, it wasn't always easy or really ever, because, at 16 I was hanging out with Grace and Shay and, we thought, Julie and I thought maybe we were going to a potluck and eating dinner and we might laugh about something. And I remember Grace was like, "Excuse me, can we have your attention over here? We need your input on this very serious world issue right now." And that's what conversations were like, and it was just so important. And I felt really listened to even at 16. And like Shay is so good at tonight, Grace was also very good at saying, well, Becca can speak at this function in front of 1 million people, or she'll talk about what they invited me to talk about. So that was definitely Grace and Jimmy. And I think it's so applicable to today and what's going on in the world today and what time it is on the clock of the world today, that we need to listen. And that's so hard. And that's the answer, is asking the question and listening to what's in people's hearts.
So you said that was so Grace and Jimmy, right?
Yeah.
And for me, hearing that, part of what I would want to emphasize is that there are many people in the room and many more out here who saw and heard and experienced that with Grace. Mm-hmm. Grace asking those questions, Grace looking to younger people, and of course, everyone was younger person. But seriously, her having that practice, that orientation of generally wanting to hear what younger people say, asking them questions. And so for you to say that was Jimmy and Grace, I think is important for those of us who didn't know, had the opportunity to know Jimmy, that what we experienced with Grace was her carrying on, and adding to, but carrying on what her and Jimmy together had created. Mm-hmm. And so they together had, they grew together. They learned from each other. And Grace wrote about and often would say her and Jimmy were very different people, the personality and so forth. But as intellectuals, as thinkers, and as activists, they also were different people. As some of the room can attest to with specific examples. But that was generative, that they brought that together and shared that and grew together. And so it's, again, with some of the experience with Grace in the last, over the last part of her life after Jimmy, I think it's valuable for us to know that was created out of what she built with him. The two of them built together.
The dynamic when they work together, it's so funny because even when I think about Grace, for so many years after that, I think of Grace as Jimmy and Grace. So, but the dynamic, so the funny thing about it is I think of it that way because Grace was always the voice, in my experience of Jimmy and Grace. Grace was the voice of many questions. But I always felt like they both were absorbing all of the conversations and the listening. And then Jimmy and Grace would contribute together to build that conversation and connect people to it and connect people to each other.
I don't want to collapse and say that they weren't two individuals, they were, but I think there's some value in understanding what they brought to each other and how that is what they brought to others.
To suggest maybe you want to read a section of Grace meeting Jimmy at the third level is a school.
Third layer school?
Third layer school, because it's a political it wasn't just Grace was nice or just wanted to listen to people.
No.
Right? She was listening for a particular reason. And it comes from the history.
She wasn't nice, right? Some people say she wasn't nice.
It wasn't
But I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think we're celebrating the book.
Well, I just don't want to see what you're saying.
The other part of it is if Jimmy spoke, after he would ask about your kids and ask about your car, he would start a conversation starting from feudalism. And go on and on and on until he got to his point. So it wasn't like you weren't there listening while they were talking.
But I cut you off. You were saying that the point that Grace wasn't asking questions just to be nice. She was asking questions because she wanted.
I'm not sure what I was going to say, but because there was a historical
reason
view and theory of change that had to do with the relationship of intellectuals to the community, intellectuals to workers, intellectuals to women, intellectuals to blacks, intellectuals, however those framings were done in the 40s and 50s.
And that's why you referenced the third layer school. Yeah. The third layer school was this moment where, in that small Marxist organization in which they were a part, Grace was one of the leaders, they had the view that the intellectuals like her should sit and listen and learn from the workers. In particular, they were very much focused on rank and file industrial workers at the moment in 1952.
Okay. Well, one thing I've been thinking about since you started with the fundamental contradiction, and since you talked about this moment, and something that I think Grace got from Jimmy was that Jimmy had no illusions about the violence and destructiveness of America. And Rick and I were talking today, and we were involved in the anti-nuclear 1982 march in New York. And Jimmy's comment was, America will not get rid of nuclear power until we lose a whole city. And even then, I'm not sure we would do it. So I don't think he would have been surprised by what's happening now. And yet, the other thing that came into my mind was Jimmy saying at Jim Chafer's
I
class,
was about to say
right,
yes.
ain't nobody can run this country better than me. And when he said that in his thick Alabama accent,
Right.
the students laughed. And he yelled at them, you better think like that too. And the sense that ordinary people have to be responsible for where this country goes. And unless we are, that violence and that ugliness, which is such a part of us, will just continue.
Absolutely. Yeah, I neglected to reference that, Jimmy saying that, that Rebecca's comment made me think of it, so that's why I was nodding. I think that's crucial to understand them, but also to think about how we think about today. He thought that he can run the country better than anyone. It was encouraging college students to think that way.
So you read to us and then we're going to
Yes.
continue.
We had to do that. I don't know if I can find the passage that Rick was referring to. So instead, I'm going to read the passage as they referred to earlier that represents the title of the book. So this is at the end of the introduction. Sometime in her 8th decade, Grace began closing her correspondence with the words, "in love and struggle." It was a particularly fitting expression, as so much of her life, her thinking and writing, her activism, her personal and political relationships, so much of it revolved around or in some way grew from her commitment to social and political struggles. Moreover, she embraced struggle not just in opposing a system or an external enemy, but also as struggle as a difficult but necessary internal process in the movement, in the organization, and in oneself. The progress required to resolve contradictions. She shared that embrace of struggle with Jimmy. Indeed, their partnership shaped and deepened this embrace of struggle for each of them. Her phrase then is just as fitting for a book that tells their story. These two things, love and struggle, were central to their lives together. Moreover, combining the two words not only indicates the importance that Jimmy and Grace assigned to each, but also signals their view that struggle, like love, is an inevitable and enduring part of life. In their jointly authored book, Revolution and Evolution in the 20th Century, Jimmy and Grace concluded that there is, quote, no final struggle to be waged, no promised land to be reached, as humankind will always be engaged in struggle, because struggle is in fact the highest expression of creativity. Thinking about an expression of creativity, I'll close with this. These words from a poem in tribute to Grace by Annette House. You gave energy, gesture, laughter. You gave flesh and bone to the idea of revolution. In your steadfastness, we witnessed that being a revolutionary requires patience and faith to walk the evolutionary path day by day. To be sure, Grace and Jimmy gave these and more. They gave much to each other, and together they gave much to the movements they joined, struggles they waged, organizations they built, and the many comrades with which they worked, organized, studied, and struggled.
One of the rules that we have here at Source Booksellers is that we like to hear every single voice. And so we didn't get to everybody tonight, but everybody has a word that they could say to Stephen for his wonderful, diligent, deep, thoughtful work that he's presented to us today. So think about one word that you just like to stick on him. And when I count to 3, do it. Ready? Got it? 1, 2, 3.
You may have noticed Frank reference 3061 Field Street. That's the home that Grace and Jimmy shared, which also is the home of the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center for National Community Leadership. So we would like to sign your name and email here if you'd like to join, to sign up to receive the newsletter of the Boggs Center, which of course is trying to carry on the Boggs legacy.